Greetings, this is Vane and welcome back to Let's Play Mordor, Depths of Dejenol. Okay, where did we get to? Guys, in between playing this, I'm also waffling about basically the history of D&D. Which is the history of tabletop gaming, really. Tabletop role-playing, that is. You had a couple of other companies, but for the most part D&D was the main one. The market leader. I think it ran about sometime in the 80s. I think it's about the mid to late 80s. I am going to say 86 off the top of my head. I mean, I can go and have a look. I've got pretty much every edition, a copy of every edition of D&D around somewhere. So... and, yeah. So, AD&D, I mean, basically AD&D is known mostly for its adventures. There were like several series. You had the GDQ series Against the Giants and Descent into the Underdark, and then basically all the way up to dealing with Lolthus in the Queen of the Demon Pits, in the Abyss, Queen of the Demon Web Pit or whatever. And that was like a mega series of modules. You had Against the Save Laws, which was based on a series of tournament modules, because the thing about AD&D rather, was it was played competitively in tournaments by a lot and conventions. Where the idea was basically you'd have a dungeon challenge and you'd be scored based on how far you got through it and various other criteria. But yeah, I mean, by that time I think Dragonlance had come out. Forgotten Realms had started being developed, because a new world, because I think by that point Gary Gygax had been oofed out of the system. So even though he created D&D, he no longer owned TSR. And I think Arneson was also out at that point, having sold up, largely because of the split, I think, but it's speculation. And this is me rambling, this is not me doing this is basically off the top of my head as I remember it. I've got a book here which is telling me what it is. And without a book in front of me, I'm not very good with dates. Never have been. Like, dates and numbers tend to get a bit vague, which is annoying considering how much I end up using them. But hey, it's fun as dyslexia. Or dyslexia. Dyslexia or lysdexia or whatever you want to call it. You know. But yeah, around about 86, I'm going to say. AD&D got a revision and was revised to second edition, which was basically a refresh of the rules, an attempt to make it a bit more consistent. which worked for the first book, but then had so much bolted onto it that it just went crazy. Plus, you had a lot of worlds come out. That was where Planescape and Planescape, Birthright, Dark Sun. A lot of the later stuff was all pushed out. It was interesting because it was like every time TSR had an idea or a separate idea, they would create a product line out of it. The problem was that they would often end up, unless you had a load of disposable income, that it was hard to keep up with everything. So back to the dungeon. Yeah. Okay. And you'd have you had like second edition AD&D, which lasted quite a while. It would go up until third edition, which would come out shortly after Wizards of the Coast actually acquired TSR, based largely on the popularity of Magic funding the company, which would be at the turn of the century, so like 2000. So about 5 years after this game was made. And what was interesting with AD&D is that they kind of focused a lot more on getting the game out of the dungeon and into storytelling. So a lot of the modules were adventures and quests rather than with encounters, rather than being this is a dungeon that you get to explore. And I think that kind of suited their idea of where they were going with like the various worlds and campaigns. Instead of being like first AD where it was like, okay, here's a dungeon, here's the story behind the dungeon, go and explore it. It would be like, okay, this is your quest. This is what you've got to do. You've got to travel here, 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 and here. And these are the events that happen on your journey, you know. And the kind of sad thing was that in doing so, and that sort of method, you kind of lost the hex crawl. I mean, a lot of that was kind of, I mean, Dragonlance and the War of the Lance was basically your big module series, which was an epic quest and was brought out alongside another, and was quite interesting as a project and probably one of my favourite settings. But then that's because I really like the novels. One of the innovations they brought in was that the idea of random story encounters. Basically, and this was thanks to Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss, that's how you pronounce her name, was basically, although you had like, hex crawls, which was like you'd go grid from grid, these would put area classes, and it would be like, okay, instead of having grid by grid where you just get random monsters, it was areas based on a world where you'd get random encounters, and they would be pretty much anything. But it would be those random encounters that would shape the story. For example, in the first module of the Dragonlance series, you had the lands of Abanazia, and what you'd see is that, I mean, the main quest was literally setting up the premise, having the characters escape Solace, which was the starting town, as the region was slowly being invaded by the dragon armies. Eventually, depending how they go, the party would be directed to Zaktarsof, where they would find the discs of Mishkal in order to bring back knowledge of the gods. It's quite epic. But it would be, wherever they would go, you'd have events that would lead them to what they needed to do, which was go to Zaktarsof, and that was the dungeon, and you'd face your first dragon in there, and the module ended once you'd recovered the discs of Mishkal, and the cleric of the party, because it was always good to have the cleric there, basically rediscovered the gods. So yeah, that was like the first example of emergent gameplay that, although it was sort of a hex crawl, it wasn't a hex crawl because of the random story encounters. And it was those random story encounters which kind of built the adventure up, as opposed to a lot of key locations in a random wilderness where you would explore hex by hex. And that kind of put a shift for AD&D second towards more storytelling and more mission-based gaming than just dungeon exploration. And what's interesting is around 91, 92, basic D&D was revived again, and this time it was released in the revised edition, where you had basically the beginner's box set, which instead of taking you to level 3 took you up to level 5 this time, giving a bit more scope for basic adventures, and kind of useful because it meant that wizards actually got to a point where they would be able to cast Fireball and Lightning Bolt and all the big flashy spells they're known for. So it was quite the pinnacle of power, as it were. while the full rules, which covered going up to level 36, were combined in the D&D Encyclopedia, and was basically their Beckme rules without the rules for the Immortals. I mean, even though you'd get the basic set didn't actually state where it was set, although you explored Zanza's dungeon, and it was basically a tutorial dungeon adventure as your prisoners that are escaping Zanza's dungeon, and you would slowly go through rooms to learn how to fight. And the original portion was quite linear, but quite fun at teaching the game, because it would teach you as you played. And it came with a poster map, so it was quite like a board game, which was important. Because for me, that was how I started with D&D back in '92. Because I bought it because of the poster map, and it looked a lot like Hero Quest and Advanced Hero Quest, which were of Dungeoneering board games from Games Workshop and Milton Bradley, which were now owned by Hasbro. Despite being set in the Warhammer world. Which is why it's quite interesting that then the American stuff and is actually Hero Quest outside of the Warhammer world, because they realised they didn't actually have the license to use it once they stopped working with Games Workshop. So yeah, and we're in a schism that happened in around '89. And it would be that basic set that would go back around to adventuring in dungeons as the primary game. I mean, the idea of poster maps and having your kind of big colourful boards to play on to make it more like a game would also go for D&D, AD&D, because you'd have poster maps included with their basic set with like, say, First Quest, for example, which was also when they started experimenting with CD technology to provide audio music and audio tracks, which was an interesting experiment. But ultimately, it just kind of made, while it was good to have the multimedia, it just made the products more expensive. So sadly, it didn't quite work for them in how they wanted. And that very rough, garbled history brings us up to like the mid-90s, which was when I started getting into Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, I'd played a lot of Warhammer and then progressed to Warhammer Fantasy, and like I said, my first role-playing was actually the easy to master box set of D&D Revised. So have a look what we got down here. Tome of Leadership, okay. Tome of Leadership. But Revised D&D was still basically old school, and it was largely focused around dungeon exploration. So even then, it was like that was your basic old school link to Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, in terms of video games, top-down turn-based kind of approach had been used a couple of times. But the idea of just being like top-down with a wireframe map, for example, was very Ultima and Might and Magic. All of which were basically pretty old school dungeon crawlers for the computer. And ported on various platforms. And they were all kind of mid to late 80s because of the technology. So a lot of them were on 8-bit home computers. Some got transferred to the NES and stuff like that. And you can clearly see these influences here, because basically the whole get experience from killing monsters, the 6 stats. I mean, the guilds are, and the ability to change is quite an interesting change. Because in D&D it'd be like your class was set, you couldn't really change a class. That would be what your character is, and ultimately what you could do, and you knew what you were going to get at later levels. But having the ability where you can change and build a character from it is quite interesting here. But for the most part, it's basically D&D. Which is cool if like me, you like that sort of thing. Or love it in my case, because I'm not going to deny that. So, for me though, I was born in 81, which meant that I was 19 when at the turn of the millennium, which was shortly before Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition was released. The aims of which was basically to provide a unified system, which it did amazingly well with the D20 system. Kind of codifying pretty much everything, because it wanted to be comprehensive with a strong basic foundation. But for me, I mean, that kind of period, especially with the explosion of third-party products, you definitely couldn't keep up with all of them, but you had to have your favourites, and there were a lot of good choices for me, I mean, my favourite I think is actually Spycraft, which was by AEG and Crafty Games, which was based on Spycraft and Fantasycraft. And it was literally the D20 system converted to the pulp espionage genre, which was cool. So you had the same basic framework, but a different genre, and you saw that with a lot of things. I mean, TSR experimented with different genres, and a lot of time it would be very similar, but ultimately it would be its own system, and you could convert between various settings and systems, but it was a lot of work. But ultimately you had like Gangbusters, which was interesting. I mean, I actually got a copy of Gangbusters when I joined the RPGA, the Role Playing Games Association. Because the disadvantage that I had was that I only had a very small circle of friends that actually were even interested in D&D or anything like that. And I think at most if I wasn't going to an actual role-playing group, which I did in the noughties, because that was a good time for me, because I was actually working in a game store for a short period. It was like a couple of months, but it gave me a lot of spare income and a staff discount, and I think ultimately I spent more than I earned. But in doing so, kind of opened up a lot of contacts for me and gave me a lot of exposure to the D20 system, because in the noughties I was also working on the Legend of Zelda D20 role-playing game, which was the first full fan conversion of the Legend of Zelda into a role-playing system. And although it would take ultimately about 4 years before it got released, I still have the experience that basically we started off on a Wizard's thread, and I don't know why I go that way. We started off on a Wizard's thread on the Wizards forum. Moved to a Yahoo group, and we were discussing about how to put it together as a product. And basically, I took it upon myself to basically do the layout and to put it into a product that kind of mirrored the Player's Handbook in style and tone. And in doing so, with the mock-up of what we had, we kind of realised that actually there was the basis of a project there, and we could see the bits that we just needed to fill in. So I like to pride myself, because I think that if I hadn't have made that first prototype and demonstrated, then that we could do a product, then it would never have happened. And it wasn't a small thing. The document was about 300 pages. It rivaled the player's handbook in terms of quality. And that's where I first kind of developed my layout skills as a layout artist, which is quite interesting considering I'm dyslexic, because it also meant that for a while I was the kind of editor, because I was collecting everything and putting it in. So I had to check all the spellings. It's also on that project is where I met Oro from Realm of the Ouroboros. Shout out to him. The one who comments on my videos, even if the comments are rather inane. I mean, I've known him for 20 years. Never met him. We do speak online, I know, and we've done a bit of gaming and it's especially with him and his sister and my old partner, we used to have a bit of an online gaming group. I mean, Oro's fun. So, he's a good artist, but goes for a more cartoony, sketchy style than sort of photorealism. He likes to make comics, which I kind of help with the editing a bit for the words, because English is like his third language. Because he's Dutch, and I think his second language is actually German. But yeah, so he tends to kind of write English very phonetically. Didn't want that. Yeah, we're not going to finish this. Okay. But yeah, so I kind of got used to editing his style, because in terms of English grammar, it's not brilliant. And it turns out that despite my dyslexia, I'm actually quite good. I mean, I've been tested and been rated the top 1% of the country. Despite my dyslexia. So even though I write slow, and it takes me time, I'm quite a good writer. Can write like high level policy documents, that sort of thing. It just takes me time. Plus, I don't actually mind writing. I often prefer writing to reading, to be honest. Not reading. Prefer writing to speaking. And you may notice that I kind of stumble over my words a lot and kind of trail off, and mostly it's because it turns out that my dyslexia is basically working memory dyslexia. So my ability to hold stuff in my head and to think and process information without, I can do it. It's like, basically it's like maths. I can do maths. It's easier for me to do maths on paper, being able to write down rather than trying to keep numbers in my head. It's also why I'm not very good with dates, because I'm better off basically learning stories, and because I do actually have to learn stuff rather than kind of memorize it. And the more I talk about things, the more it goes into a different part of the memory that my memory that works better. So yeah, see what we got. There's a tome of learning. We're giving you a tome of agility. Okay. A tome of agility too. So yeah. I find it quite amusing that, and a lot of people don't actually believe I'm dyslexic, but I have been formally assessed. And what makes it worse is because of my intelligence, and I am highly intelligent despite my things, and that's not just a brag. Again, I've been tested. Top terms of top 1% for verbal reasoning, top 3% for logical reasoning. So despite being dyslexic, I am immense a level. It's just sometimes I have trouble remembering things. So if it's an open book exam, I can find the information. Might take a bit of time, but I can find it, and I can put forth a compelling argument based on stuff I've got on hand. But if you're asking me for quotes and sources, unless I'm specifically prepared in advance with said quotes and sources, it's hard for me to just kind of go, okay, this is where I got this from. Unless it's a source that I use quite often. For example, and I find this interesting, rules. Rules in rulebooks. The more I use them, the more I remember the rules, and it's like, okay, that's the page that it says. Still not necessarily remembering page numbers, but it means that I can go to it easier in the book and quote. So yeah. I mean, I've kind of got through life by liking stories and games, and role-playing games are brilliant because they're basically games about telling stories. And since both are tools for learning and have helped me kind of get around my dyslexia, plus it's encouraged me to learn a lot of varied stuff. I mean, when you want to try and put a cohesive world, you suddenly start learning geography and history and language and science, physics, chemistry, you name it. Biology. If there's a field of study, you know, as a GM who's trying to put a comprehensive world, you probably want to know the basics of it. And in the end, I've actually studied both natural and social science, which is quite interesting because most people often focus on one or the other and then have arguments about which is superior. And it's like, they're both science. If I had to choose, I would say social science is slightly better. But that's only because a lot of what we call science and knowledge is actually based on this epistemology, the knowledge, basically the theory and knowledge of understanding and learning. So what we call the scientific method, which is often quoted as being the source of objectivity and why natural science is so brilliant for people who believe in, for people who like, they are like, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. That's the argument that you get, you know. It's like, well, yeah, that is a human construct and we've shaped that. And yes, the aim is to be as objective as possible, but we can't actually get out of that system completely, especially when we're dealing with understanding human subjects and our experience of the world. So as much as we try to be objective, we can't be totally objective because we don't know enough, and we can't really separate what we're doing from what we're not doing. And largely that's because the sort of questions that we ask define the answers that we get. Okay, let's see, endurance might learn it, it's going to be endurance, isn't it? Yeah. So I'm going to dive into the dungeon quickly because I want to use this time of endurance. There we go. Constitution of 7, that's not bad. Okay, so enough of my waffling about me, about gaming, about whatever. This has been Vane. I'm doing Let's Play Mordor, Depths of Dejenol. If you like what you're seeing here, be sure to like, subscribe, share and comment. Please consider sponsoring me on Patreon. And until next time, goodbye.